work and content.
Just because I'm all in, I'm crazy. Like people shouldn't be me. I don't have a life. I don't have work-life balance. My personality, my soul, my being is making the best videos possible, entertaining my fans as best as I can. Like that is what exists on this planet. And I don't recommend it.
With MrBeast even saying that he's miserable sometimes because he's always obsessing over his content. With that, Polygon noting that even though he has been open about how taxing this is on him, it's somehow still viewed positively. Saying Donaldson candidly reveals the tough conditions that make his videos possible, like building a friend group that constantly criticizes his output and axing expensive, fully finished videos that he's unsure about. But because he's rich and famous, no matter how rocky it gets, his road is seen as aspirational. Right? And with this, the piece overall arguing that he's created this click-focused hustle culture on the platform. The outlet then even going on to talk about how there have been different eras on YouTube in the past, with the current one being defined by MrBeast. But also with that, noting we could be shifting to a new era where people want authenticity, to feel the other human on the other side of the screen. And with that, strategist Zachary Smigel telling the outlet, the return to an authentic era on YouTube comes down to a growing fatigue with sensationalism. I think we are witnessing a cultural shift, and then wondering if that's something that MrBeast will pivot to. And so with all this, we've seen the article's focus kind of results in a ton of people having big reactions online saying, no amount of success is worth erasing your personality because you view it as a liability for optimal content, as well as chasing algorithms in pursuit of fame is an annihilation of self and should not be aspired to. And in general, it seemed like a lot of people just kind of found it to be a depressing read. But ultimately, here's what I'll say with this, even though there were a lot of different points and arguments and debates being had here. One, I don't think there's anything weird about him saying like, I just want someone I can read books with and watch documentaries with. That just sounds like a guy that wants a partner that's interested in similar things. Two, regarding him saying, when I'm not working, he's thinking, I could be making $100,000 an hour, so how do I justify this? Well, the rate per hour there is not something I can relate to. The idea in general is something I can relate to. I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but I think it's also something that a lot of self-employed people can relate to. Right? I'm constantly thinking about the ROI of my time. What's the return on investment of my time? And I mean, it took me over a decade, probably like 15 years to realize you just got to look at things as different kinds of investment. Right? Money is important, livelihood's important, but I don't think I'm going to be on my deathbed wishing I made an extra 50K. I'm probably going to be wishing I spent more time with my kids. So I've just kind of expanded the idea of what kind of returns I can get on the investment of my time. Mental health and emotion when it comes to hanging out with my kids, my wife, my family, my friends. Being fulfilled there, I think it makes me also better at my job. Taking care of my health like I have over the past 2 years. Great for me physically, great for me mentally, and also in an ideal world, I live longer. I'm able to do what I want and love for even longer. Also, the idea of stressing out over a thumbnail, not stupid. It's literally half, if not more, of the reason someone watches your video. And while I know there's so much more here, the final thing that I'll touch on is regarding the idea that we're like shifting eras when it comes to creators and content creation. One, I think if you watch some of MrBeast's newer content, not all of it, but an increasing amount, we're kind of seeing a decrease in like the brain rot. There has to be a change every 1.5 second kind of edits, more focused on people, the storytelling, stuff like that. And this also, as there's been an increase of people, yes, wanting more connection to creators. Even though there is a valid point in who you are is both your best thing and your worst thing. Like, because I am who I am, there are going to be some people that naturally gravitate towards me, and there are going to be other people that are like, I'm in no way interested, which is why it's understandable that a lot of content creators focus specifically on like, what is the content? It's also part of the appeal of having faceless channels, right, where you don't even see the creator. But one, I think with the rise of TikTok and like this increase of just people who are everyday people that have gotten an audience again, which is kind of old school YouTube, people absolutely love that. And then there are also people that kind of bridge that divide. With one of my favorite examples is always being Casey Neistat. He is a filmmaker. He understands how to tug on the emotions, doing certain little things, but also in a really authentic and real way. Like his video from over a month ago, Sisyphus and the Impossible Dream, it's one of my favorite pieces of content on this platform. It's a fantastic personal story and a wild piece of content that connects to pretty much anyone that has a dream. But again, to close this out, bringing it back to MrBeast, I think it's hard to have a fully locked in opinion on this because he's still just in the middle of his story. And he is at a height that's really not been seen in this online age. Like if he uploads a video to his main channel and it only gets 100 million views, that video bombed. Like that's insane. That's 100 million YouTube views. This isn't like the fucking bullshit bloated stuff on Twitter/X. This guy is regularly doing numbers that we really haven't seen since like in America there were fewer than 10 channels. And I'm talking about TV channels like MASH, one of the most popular shows of all time. Its finale got just under 106 million views. And I really don't know if you can accomplish that without being uniquely and probably detrimentally obsessed. And then what you think you know about human trafficking might actually be wrong. But also, it's not your fault because it's a problem that's been severely impacted by misinformation over the last several years. And as we've seen, that misinformation can have serious consequences, right? It impacts efforts to combat actual trafficking, and it can also create setbacks for victims and survivors. Because we want to try to unpack all this, we spoke to Megan Cutter, the director of the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And one of the things she did is she explained that when a piece of misinformation takes off, it can bog down the hotline and law enforcement and take them away from more pressing concerns.
For example, in 2020, during the Wayfair conspiracy, we received a 400% increase in calls, texts, and chats to the National Human Trafficking Hotline over a very short period of time, which made it harder for us to actually help people who needed assistance and who were trying to get through to get help versus people who I think generally very well intentioned were trying to report something that was both all the information was really publicly available and being reported in the media, and also was law enforcement confirmed to be something that was not happening.
Right, and the Wayfair example was one really big, elaborate conspiracy that blew up. But there are also much smaller, more everyday pieces of misinformation that have taken off, and you've probably encountered some through TikTok. Videos about your car tagged by zip ties or menus or getting lured in by abandoned car seats. But the thing is, Polaris, the nonprofit that operates the National Human Trafficking Hotline, they've debunked these time and time again, noting that this image that we have of victims being kidnapped by random strangers is inaccurate, because most victims were actually coerced by people they know, like their family or their romantic partner. But the Department of Health and Human Services also noting that the image that we have of people being physically held or bonded, it's often inaccurate as well, as traffickers mostly use psychological means of control, with them explaining fear, trauma, drug addiction, threats against families, and a lack of options due to poverty and homelessness can all prevent someone from leaving. Some individuals who experience trafficking may also be manipulated or believe they're in love with their trafficker, which can make them resistant to seeking help. And adding that traffickers might isolate victims from their families and control their money, their ID, their documents, all to trap them. But the videos explaining these realities, they just don't always get as much traction as the ones with misinformation. And that can even impact a victim's perception of trafficking, right? It makes it harder for them to identify themselves as a victim. And it can also make it harder for them to share their stories later on.
Some of the things that we've seen online when there is a lot of misinformation happening about trafficking is that people who speak out and say, I'm a survivor of trafficking and this is how my situation happened, often face kind of backlash from other people online who say, that's not true, this is how this really happens. And so I think it can really impact the way people who are survivors of trafficking are able to tell their story and are believed and are seen in the public sphere.
We also have Cutter noting that these people spreading these false ideas often have good intentions, even if they're wrong. And it is important to note and understand that, because shaming people actually doesn't do much to fight against misinformation. Most of the time, they're not intentionally trying to interfere with efforts to fight trafficking. But the videos that go viral are genuinely scary, right? They stoke a lot of panic. And maybe some of these people have encountered a potentially threatening situation, right? If you think you're being followed or you see something odd in public, use those street smarts. If you feel unsafe, still assess the situation. But to label everything that looks potentially dangerous as a human trafficking ploy, it's just not productive.
I think it really takes away from people understanding how trafficking really happens, and also takes attention and resources and conversation away from understanding that trafficking is inherently this exploitation of power and control, and that, people are often in a trusting relationship with their trafficker. And so it switches the conversation to something that doesn't help us actually prevent or identify trafficking.
And there are a lot of reasons that many people just inherently have a false image of what trafficking looks like. For example, in the past, Polaris has called out the Liam Neeson film Taken as a piece of media that really drove those false images home. It created a lot of fear. Solid movie, though. I'll pretty much always buy a ticket to watch Liam Neeson punch people. But Polaris noting that all these years later, the hotline's still dealing with the consequences of that movie, which, spread false narratives about kidnapping, as well as stereotypes about it being like things that happen abroad and not stateside.
Even when I'm just talking with folks about what my job is, 9 times out of 10, someone brings up the movie Taken. So it's very much part of the way we talk about human trafficking, even though it's not how we see human trafficking happening in the United States.
Right, with Cutter going on to say that even though it was just a movie, it spawned massive cultural ripple effects. And because these myths and these false narratives have become so pervasive and ingrained in our culture, there's a lot of work that has to be done to clear things up. And also with that, you had Cutter noting that social media platforms themselves should really make sure they combat misinformation that spreads on their platform.
Also being able to think about how do we amplify the voices of people who've actually experienced trafficking, survivors who are out there sharing their stories to correct the narrative. I think that's a really meaningful way to be able to understand how trafficking really happens, is to listen to the people who've been in those situations themselves and hear from them and amplify and share their stories.
And with all this, Cutter also adding that discussing this issue requires a lot of sensitivity, and no one should ever be forced to share their story.
We make a real effort to share those stories on our own social media. We work in partnership with survivors to do that, making sure that they, consent and are comfortable sharing. Also, something that is really important is when you're asking someone to share information about their experience, to compensate them appropriately for their labor. And I think that's something that we've talked a lot about in the anti-trafficking field, because trafficking is a crime that inherently exploits people. And so making sure in that sharing of information, we're not re-exploiting anyone.
And the compensation aspect is one that probably not a lot of people think about, right? But, how often are you watching a documentary or a show, or you see an awareness ad about some kind of tragic situation and it feels really emotionally manipulative or exploitive of the source material? And this act of sort of vulturously capitalizing on someone's trauma could prevent people down the line from sharing their own stories, right? They might not want to be the next face out there. So that compensation element, obviously in combination